He shot through the window. Just a few meters away, the Russians were trying to surround him. It was another wave of attack, one in which the Ukrainian would be face to face with his opponents, close enough that they could hear his last words. During a nighttime attack, Kiev's soldiers were surrounded by Russian artillery as they tried to approach the Russian defenders. At another point in the war, Moscow's squads had already organized themselves to enter Ukrainian positions, trying to surround the defenders. Moscow's drones were always watching, often seeing the Ukrainians distracted. A message put an anti-tank guided missile team into action, aiming at the enemy trench. It was the beginning of the battles. Toward Toretsk, a new direction in the war. The war in Ukraine periodically highlights the names of different cities. When Russian forces focused their clashes in certain regions, Bakhmut was one of the most famous, and the battle that changed the course of the war, with new strategies created by the Wagner Group which allowed the capture of Soledar to the north, and then the complete conquest of one of the main Ukrainian strongholds in 2023. This capture opened up space for fighting against nearby cities, such as Toretsk further south. The Battle of Toretsk began in 2024. Before focusing on the city, the Russians carried out an intense campaign which ended with the capture of Avdiivka. These victories advanced Moscow's gains, but, according to one of their own war correspondents, at a high cost, maybe 10,000 casualties. Just in the span of a few months when the efforts were focused, not counting all the previous time of fighting in the region where the conflict had persisted since 2014. It was common to forget that the war began in 2014 with Russia funding separatist groups and sending its soldiers into Ukraine. So when names appeared in the headlines, it seemed like the fighting toward a city happened in just a month or two. Toretsk was an example of that, but the whole context for the Russians fighting in that direction started back in 2014. With the capture of Olivika in April 2014, pro-Russian separatists took over several cities in Donetsk Oblast, including Orlivka. They seized key buildings, detained the mayor, and kidnapped local officials. On the 21st and 22nd, there was intense fighting with Ukrainian forces recapturing parts of the city, but the separatists maintained control. On July 28th, Olivka was surrounded by Ukrainian troops, but the rebels held out. In June 2015, the city remained 10 kilometers from the front line with its suburb under Ukrainian control. In November 2017, Ukraine recaptured villages to the west of Orlivka. The battles were less famous, but they were still tough at that time. Even without the drones, which became the scourge of infantry and mechanized battalions, there were fierce fights around Olivka. The rebels maintained a constant defense to prevent the city from being taken by the Ukrainians. The sound of rifles and machine guns could be heard from afar, to the point of scaring many local residents. The Ukrainian artillery tried to retaliate against the Russians, hitting their howitzers. Drones were used almost exclusively for reconnaissance at a time when little thought was given to their different types of use, as would happen later in the conflict. The rifle fired in fury on the morning of February 18, 2022. A squad of Ukrainian special forces was ambushed on the outskirts of Olivika. The sounds of so many gunshots filled the freezing morning. The wounded man rolled on the ground, unable to move. He stayed still, breathing with difficulty, the camera recording the sound of his lungs struggling for air, until one of his comrades appeared to rescue him. It was the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The separatist forces armed by Moscow, more specifically troops from the Donetsk People's Republic or Donetsk People's Republic, fired their APGMs at the Ukrainian forces. These groups used Orlivka as a base to intensify the fighting that had already been going on for 8 years. Russian Su-25 planes flew over Ukrainian positions on the outskirts of the city, showing that the fighting would now be on another level. Their bombs fell on the soldiers, who, until that moment, were not used to this new level of war. This led to the abandonment of some Ukrainian positions. These trenches were quickly taken by the Russians, who adapted them to be their own defensive positions. The Ukrainians shelled these locations, trying to stop any advance by the separatist forces, now with the full support of Moscow's armed forces. The bombs exploded, increasing the sound of fear among the residents who still insisted on living in Olivika. A Russian ammunition depot was even hit, increasing the number of smoke columns in the surrounding area. The secondary explosions created panic among the civilians. These people filmed the Ukrainian missiles hitting the separatists' positions. Even after living so long near the front, they knew that the battles now, in 2022, were very different from the last 8 years. A Russian tank supporting the separatists appeared to attack the Ukrainian positions. The 5th Assault Regiment of Ukraine sent its own tank to fire at that machine. The Russian armored vehicle was directly hit. The 3rd Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Donetsk People's Republic put its artillery to work against the Ukrainian defenses that persisted around Orlivka. They were fierce shots against the men. The strikes hit the ground near the trenches. The soldiers from Kiev were consumed in the midst of the smoke. Every place where they tried to hide was hit with more gunpowder. There was nothing they could do against a powerful and renewed artillery that appeared on the battlefield. Russian helicopters like the Ka-52 danced in the skies, freely firing their rockets. That horrific display involving the soldiers weakened the hearts of those who saw men burned or torn apart by so many shots. The Ukrainians still tried to defend themselves when the assaults began. Large squads of Russians surrounded the trenches. The defenders placed the zakat over the holes. They emptied their magazines in the direction of the Russians. However, the assault squad's coordination was good. They slowly approached until they surrounded the defenders, alone or in small groups. Many of them surrendered. Some villages around Olivika, both to the south and to the north, were taken over. In 2022, at that time, however, the front didn't expand much in the direction of Toretsk. The Russians focused on what was around. Still having to deal with the offensive allowed the Ukrainians to retake many of the territories. That same year, the Donetsk People's Republic separatists managed to keep a firm control over Olivika, so much so that they carried out a mobilization in the city, recruiting 6,000 soldiers. This, combined with the exodus caused by the war, made the male population almost extinct in Olivika due to the mobilization for the occupation army. The drones, which became so famous in this war, also made their initial appearances near Olivika. A bored Russian, far from the major hotspots of the war, maybe thankful for not being near Bakhmut, thought he was safe in a high position. From up in the sky, the kamikaze drone targeted the lone figure and explosively descended on the Russians' shelter. He survived and ran somewhere else, trying to figure out what that buzzing sound was before the explosion. He had the chance to hear it once more. Experiencing the beginning of the mass use of kamikaze drones, the battles near Olivika gained new momentum after the fall of Bakhmut in May 2023. The Russians could look for more territory, test other Ukrainian defenses, so much so that their kamikazes flew into enemy trenches. Several consecutive dives tormented the defenders. The first signs of change appeared with these attacks. A Ukrainian BMP-2 used its 30mm automatic cannon against Russian positions, taking advantage of a hill. The Donetsk People's Republic's machine guns had set up their nests inside the towers of the Olivika mining system. The kamikaze drones exploded inside those places so high up that there was no chance for the soldiers inside to escape in time, unless they were near one of the narrow staircases. It was a time of few assaults in the region. Drones and artillery dominated their attacks, smashing into the defensive positions. The Russians sent whatever they had available at the time to eliminate the sentry soldiers around Olivika. The Ukrainians were also hit by Boyevaya Mashina, 21-grad fire. These rocket launchers were quick in their firing. According to Kyiv, sometimes they were used from inside residential areas in Olivika. A long time later, the Ukrainians made their drones dance under Russian artillery, delivering precise strikes. The abundant Grad ammunition exploded, ending any chance of repairing the equipment. The Ukrainians also managed to hit fuel depots belonging to Moscow's forces. Kiev's forces also had their own launchers. The Raymars had arrived on the battlefield, being one of the major highlights in 2023. The drone found a Ural 4320 military truck carrying ammunition and men to an artillery position. The Raymars launched their projectiles, exploding in the midst of the Russians. The destruction spread throughout the area. When the smoke cleared, the lifeless bodies of the artillerymen were exposed on the ground. The heavy Ukrainian drones were already in operation at that time. Called Baba-Yaga by the Russians due to the myth from Slavic folklore of the powerful forest witch, they flew carrying heavy explosives. The 100th Separate Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine managed to identify the 2 Espion near Olivka. This Russian artillery had been causing suffering to the Ukrainians. A 2-7 was a 203mm self-propelled gun developed by the Soviets. Its effective range was 37 kilometers. It was no wonder it could easily hit Ukrainian positions near Olivika. Baba-Yaga flew over the Russian artillery. A command from the operator released the projectiles and let gravity do its job. The consecutive explosions destroyed the equipment. The 25th Assault Regiment of Ukraine carried out an assault on a Russian position under heavy fire. Russian bombs and RPGs exploded next to the trench as the Ukrainians moved through the tight space, trying to reach the positions where there were still Russian soldiers. The soldiers felt the heat of the explosions hit their bodies. Their ears were almost deafened after so many close blasts, but little by little they kept moving closer. The Ukrainian drones provided information so that the Ukrainian artillery could open fire on the Russians. The soldiers moved through the labyrinths, aiming their rifles at every corner, while explosions continued all around them. When they noticed the enemy nearby, they threw a grenade that exploded among the bodies squeezed together in the trench. More grenades were thrown. Until the fighting ended, with the Russians fleeing, few confrontations happened near Olivika compared to other areas. But the region was still heating up, to the point that, in 2024, the Russians unleashed even more fire on the Ukrainians. The Russian watched the Ukrainians during a moment of boredom in the trench. War was not always just the stormy fury over men's heads. Sometimes silence would take over the battlefield, and those moments could make a soldier let his guard down. The Ukrainians didn't realize that the Russians were on the opposite tree line, aiming their anti-tank guided missile. The guided missile was fired, it exploded among the Ukrainians, ending the boredom. Just like some lives, the second shot came right after. Even with a distant impact, one of the Ukrainians fell, shaken by the blast wave. This happened near Pivintin, about 11 kilometers from Olivika. In that direction, there were some villages that the Russians needed to pass through to reach Toretsk, one of their new objectives in 2024. Now, the firestorm would be intense in the region. Moscow's drones crashed into Ukrainian bases inside the village. These destroyed points began to destabilize Kiev's defenses. The Russians bombarded everything in their path, including the village of Chum, which endured powerful impacts. Russian drones launched the Vogue 30D against enemy trenches in Cham. The Vogue 30D, introduced in 2013, was a Russian 30 mm grenade designed for the AGS-17 and AGS-30 launchers, offering high impact in combat. The Ukrainians did try to stop this advance using their drones. Russian vehicles exploded, but others came. Artillery battered Cham throughout August. In no time, Russian drones were already flying in large numbers inside Perventino. Cham was already one of the support points for these attacks. Ukrainian surveillance systems began to be destroyed to make it easier for the troops to advance. The trenches were bombarded repeatedly. Little by little, these Ukrainian defenses were emptied by Russian artillery and drones. The movement of Kiev soldiers increased inside Perventino, always followed by Russian eyes. The spies in the skies watched them until they found the bases, which were brutally bombed. Repeatedly, Russian soldiers entered Perventino. Ukrainian mortars opened fire on these men, increasing the destruction of the village. The soldiers had to hold their positions, unleashing everything they had against the waves of Russian squads. They kept coming. The Akas emptied their magazines to drive the opponents away. Even so, they kept getting closer. The soldiers stayed alert, trying to see or hear the footsteps of the Russians sneaking around. More enemies came. One exposed himself too much. He took the full AK burst. The trigger pressed, released the rounds one after another into the Russian's body, adjusting the shots until finally the flesh was torn and his last scream was heard. Those waves weren't just used to take positions. If they didn't capture the target defenses, at least they exposed the Ukrainians. The soldiers waited for the bombs to fall. The first one came shortly after, landing very close, but only causing a nervous laugh from the Ukrainians. The second one hit the house directly. The men slammed against it, the walls shook. The world went dark for a second. Before one of the soldiers got up, he called out to the other and confirmed that his companion was still alive. The body of one of the Russians was left exposed in front of the Ukrainians' position. It would probably stay there until the combat zone cooled down. That could take a while, since the Russians had no intention of giving up on their advance toward Toretsk. Meanwhile, a soldier would rot in the open air, serving as a food source for the animals that still roamed the village. Thus, tragically, the war abundantly fed dogs and cats, whose homes it had itself destroyed.